Welcome. Thank you for watching this teaching video from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. Please check out our other videos and don't forget to like and subscribe. Our mission is to help people come to know Jesus better and love Him more every day. We believe this will not only help our own spiritual growth, but also help us better influence the community and the world for Christ. For more information about Oak Tree, please visit us at oaktreechurch.com. There you'll find past message series, online giving options, and more information about our discipleship process that we call The Path. Now enjoy this message. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or the website contact form. Thank you.
We are continuing our study in the life of Abraham, and we're not covering everything because, well, that would be a lot, and we're just not doing that. But what we're looking for specifically over the month of June are life lessons, specific things that we can take from Abraham's life. And it'd be good if they were all good, but sometimes, we can learn from bad too. We can learn from mistakes and bad decisions as well. And we're looking at Abraham's life and seeing if there's anything that we can take away and put into our own lives. We started last week, so just a real quick review from last week. In Genesis chapter 11 and Acts chapter 7, we learn that God actually had to call Abraham twice. I mean, he's known as the father of faith. We see him obeying God a lot in the Bible, but he did not obey every time. There were some times he made some poor decisions. And God had to call him twice because he did not finish his trip the first time. In fact, what happened is he let his family hold him back from obeying God. He was supposed to leave his family, his extended family behind, take his wife and move. Well, his dad moved with him. I don't know how he was going to stop him, chain him to a chair or something, right? His nephew moved with him and his family, and so there was this little group that was moving north out of southeastern Iraq and moved up into today what we would consider either northern Iraq or even into the Syria area a little bit, and instead of dropping off his dad and his nephew and moving on, they just stopped there in a place called Haran. And it was a worship center for the god and goddess, probably more than one gods and goddesses that Abraham and his family worshiped at that time. And he stayed there, we don't know how long, until his dad died. And that seemed to be the catalyst or the impetus that helped Abraham then move the rest of the way from Haran down into Canaan. Okay? And so we see that in some way, it was his religion, it was his family, maybe it was wealth because he became wealthy during that time, partially because of the inheritance that he received when his dad died. But partially, I think, because he set up business and he worked there for this time until Abram's dad passed away, and he somehow felt free to obey that time. And so God called him again. And at that point, he was 75 years old. We're told in Genesis chapter 12. Well, it's not on the screen because of the poetic section, but just right down there at the bottom, now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Okay? And so I don't know how old he was when God called to him the first time. I don't know how long they stayed in Haran, but he's at 75 years old now before he finally obeys, and this was the life lesson that we looked at last week, and that is, it's not too late to obey. We looked at several excuses that we make, and we learned it's not too late. Sometimes we think that, well, I'm done, God's done with me, whatever. It's not too late. If you are, it's not necessarily the nicest way to say this, but I had a friend who used to say, if you are still sucking wind, okay, we'll say breathing. If you are still breathing, it is not too late to obey. Okay? Today is the day to obey whatever it is that God has designed for you and God has designed you for. So he finally did finish the trip, and God made him a special promise that we call the Abrahamic covenant. And that starts here in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And for our purposes today, what I really want to focus on is that first phrase of verse 2. I will make you into a great nation. We're not going to do the entire covenant, but it does, as I mentioned last time, sets up the rest of the Bible. I really want to focus on that phrase. I will make you into a great nation. It sounds pretty good, right? It sounds really good. The problem is that he was 75 years old. His wife was 65 years old. He was a cradle robber. And they had no children. They had no children at 75 years old. It's really hard to make someone into a great nation when you have no descendants, when you have no children. And that problem, that issue, is what sets up what I want to look at and work through with us today. Okay? And it troubled Abraham for a long time. Now, the rest of chapter 12, along with chapters 13 and 14, are shows both some good and some bad. Okay? We're going to skip over those chapters. I highly recommend that you read them. Okay? You should read them. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. But the rest of chapter 12, after what we call the Abrahamic covenant, we see him moving. We see him making some decisions, some poor decisions, some good decisions where he's trusting God. But really, what I want to do is move to chapter 15, because what we are going to do is look at some of his questions. Some of his questions. And we're going to see Abraham questioning God in 3 parts. Okay? We're going to work in and out of chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18 today, little pieces, as we watch Abraham question God. And that'll bring us to our life lesson today. So, Genesis chapter 15. Let's look at the first 6 verses, okay? Genesis 15, verses 1 through 6. After these things, that's chapters 13 and 14, the Lord's message came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. I am your shield and the one who will reward you in great abundance. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what will you give me since I continue to be childless, and my heir is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram added, since you have not given me a descendant, then look, one born in my house will be my heir. I mean, listen, the guy's 75 years old. What else are you going to think, right? You've got to come up with something. Abram, we find out in chapter 14, had a huge corporation. I don't know if you've thought of this before. I know I've mentioned this here in the past, but it was a long time ago. Abram was the CEO of a huge corporation, an entire industry. Okay, when it says that there was not enough land for all of his ranch and his nephew's ranch in the same location, we're talking in chapter 14 that he had a 318 member private army. 318 men in his private army to help guard his ranch, and all 318 of these guys were born into his household, born into his organization, which means that they have parents. Right? Just in case you were wondering how that worked, Father's Day is coming up. These 318 had parents. Now, we can't say that all 318 were, single children or something. They may have been brothers or whatever. But let's, just for math's sake, let's say that all 318 were not siblings. They were actually children from different families. That means you can take that number and triple it. Child, father, mother. Okay? Now we have over 1,000 people who work for Abraham. Okay? Some of you don't work in organizations that are that big. Most of us do not work in organizations that are that big. Some of us do. Okay? This is Abraham and Sarah, their new names, which they're not there yet. Abraham and Sarah, plus 1,000 employees. Okay? 300 plus of which is the private security detail, the personal army that helps keep all that safe. That does not include all of his ranch hands. And at that time, it was very common, at least in sheep, I don't know if it's the same for cattle and for everything, let's just use the nice round number. It was very common for one shepherd, one ranch hand, to be able to manage 100 sheep. We see that in the Old Testament, we see that in the New Testament. So if you have 10 guys, you have potentially 1,000 sheep. If you have 100, you have potentially 10,000 sheep or animals or whatever. So this isn't just I have 1,000 employees working for me. This is I have 1,000 employees plus maybe more and tens of thousands of animals. This is not a small operation. Okay? When Abraham had a staff meeting and said it's time to move, this was an operation. Right? You got to pull everything together. This was massive, massive. And Eleazar here, in verses 2 and 3, was his, let's say, chief of staff, was his right-hand man. We're not talking just foreman. You don't have a foreman over 1,000 plus people, right? I mean, this is like the CFO. Okay? This is like high level. This is the guy. He's not just, I treat him like my son. This man was a trusted member of Abraham's team. Because we see the word heir here. My current heir is Eliezer of Damascus. Since you have not given me a descendant, look, one born in my house will be my heir. He was born in Abraham's house, whether it was while they were still in Haran, whether it was after they moved to Canaan. Well, it couldn't have been after they moved to Canaan. He would have been too young. So whether he was in Ur or whether he's in Haran, okay, one of those two places, this man has grown up. Abraham probably watched him grow up, mentored him, trained him, brought him to the point where should something happen to me, Eleazar is ready to step in and take over this massive organization. Normally, that would be a son or multiple sons, but Abraham didn't have any of those. And so, not in doubt, and this is leading to our life lesson today, this was not a question of doubt, this was actually a question of faith. He's like, God, you have entrusted me with this whole thing. And since you have not given me any descendants, since you haven't given me any children, let me suggest that this person whom I trust literally with everything I have, maybe he could be my heir. He's already in my will as my heir. Maybe you would pass the covenant blessings down with him. Should Eliezer, my paraphrase, continue as my heir? Look at God's response, starting in verse 4. But look, the Lord's message came to him. This man will not be your heir. I guess that solves that question, doesn't it? Don't you wish every question was answered quite that clearly, right? This man will not be your heir. Instead, a son who comes from your own body will be your heir. I'm 75 years old. I know time works differently, God, for you than it does for us, but time still works for us, right? I'm 75 years old. God said, the son a son who comes from your own body will be your heir. And the Lord took him outside and said, gaze into the sky and count the stars. I love that little M hyphen there, if you can. I love that, if you can. There are some scholars who think that in Abraham's day, people were not nearly as sophisticated as we are with their astronomy. And, so God says, look up into the sky and count the stars. And there are scholars and scientists who say that people back then believed that there were only about 3,000 stars because that's all you could see with the naked eye. And, it's not like they had, light pollution or anything, there's any street lights everywhere. They could actually see the sky, right? In the middle of the night. If he walked outside in the middle of the night, I'm sure that was amazing. And God said, count the stars if you can. And I love that little if you can, because God knows something that we don't know, right? And even if he could, and let's say he got up to 3,000, God said, so will your descendants be. Abraham, I'm not talking about giving you one son. I'm talking about giving you thousands. Not like biological sons, but descendants, okay? I've got to be careful with the way I say that, right? I'm going to give you thousands of descendants because the promise was I'm going to make you into a great nation, not just a big family, right? Okay. One son doesn't even make a big family, much less a great nation. So here's the result. Verse 6. And the Apostle Paul uses this verse, quotes it multiple times in the New Testament, especially in the book of Romans, where he's setting up the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith alone. And we read, Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it as righteousness to him. Notice, and we'll come back to this a little bit, notice especially when Paul used this verse to refer to salvation, Abraham didn't believe in Jesus. Abraham did not believe in the cross. Abraham didn't believe in the resurrection. Abraham believed that God made a promise and God was going to fulfill that promise, whatever that was. And God said, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for belief. I'm looking for faith. I'm looking for trust. Those three words are interchangeable in the New Testament: belief, faith, trust. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a heart that says, I trust you, God. I trust you. That's what he's looking for. Now, in chapter 15, you would expect, especially after verse 6, that that's the end of the story. Right? Abraham believed God. Great, no problem. Abraham pushes back a little bit. And you're like, hold on a second, are we allowed to do that? Well, Abraham was, so let's go with that. Look at this. The Lord said to him in verse 7, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But Abram said, now this one sounds a little... Sovereign Lord, by what can I know? How can I know that I'm supposed to or that I'm going to possess this? Now, let's say you have a child and you tell your child, this is what I'm going to do. And your child says, prove it. What's your natural reaction for that child? Be careful what you say, you're on camera, you're on tape. Right? Your natural reaction is not necessarily something kind, something nice, right? Your child says, prove it. You're like, where'd that attitude come from, right? I don't think Abraham was standing there at 75 years old. Prove it. Okay, I don't think that's exactly what he was doing, but isn't that what he asked? Isn't that what he said? He's like, how do I know? How do I know? By what can I know this? You've told me this. You've told me this multiple times. And here I am, still standing here, this great organization. I don't own a bit of land. All I own is my stuff that I brought with me. By what can I know that I'm able to possess this? This is the second question. How can I know? How can I know? And this time God's response was the official, we'll say the full Abrahamic covenant. And this is down through the rest of chapter 15. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but God said, I tell you what, you want a covenant? You want something official? You want to know that I will keep my word? Let's do this. Let's draw up the papers and I'll sign them. Basically what happened. And God said, I'll let you draw up the papers. And in this case, it was taking certain animals, chopping them in half, and creating a little path with half of the animals on, literally half of the animals, on each side of the path, so there's blood all over the place. And normally what would happen in a case like this is that the parties to the covenant, the two sides, would walk down the path between the animal pieces in the blood as it's soaking into the ground. And the concept of one of these types of covenants was basically, if I violate my part, or if you violate your part, may it be to me as happened to these animals. Okay? If I break my covenant, if I break my promise to you, let me be killed, let me be chopped apart like this in a sense, okay? Because this is a binding thing. But what's amazing is that before Abraham could stand up to get ready to walk through with God, God knocked him out. Well, the Bible says put him in a deep sleep, same thing, okay? God put him into a deep sleep. God knocked him out, laid him off to the side so he could only watch. And God alone walked through because the entire thing is up to God. There is nothing Abraham can do to break it because he wasn't part of it. This is what we would call an unconditional covenant. The only party, the only one with any obligation to do anything is God. And so for this type of covenant to be broken, for this type of covenant to be breached, it would require God to go back on his word. It would require God to be a God to be untrustworthy. Abraham could certainly screw things up even if he didn't try hard, right? Because that's what we do. If he were in there, God kicked Abraham to the curb and said, you don't get to walk through here with me. I'm going to walk through here. I am the only one who can make or break this deal. Do you trust me? That's the whole thing. Do you trust me? Abraham questioned God a couple of different times already, and we're not done yet. Abraham has questioned God a couple of times already, and each time I love that God patiently explained a little bit more of his plan. But notice that he has not given Abraham everything yet. He has not given Abraham all the answers. He's given him a little bit more of the plan each time Abraham comes back with another question. And that's what really brings us to our life lesson and a corollary principle that goes along with that. Our life lesson today is this: it is okay to question God in faith. Maybe your background, maybe your conscience, maybe your whatever says, I'm not sure if it's okay to question God. I don't know if we're allowed to question God. Doesn't doubt, doesn't sort of wavering or waffling in my mind, doesn't that mean I don't trust him? No, it doesn't. Not necessarily. Asking questions is not the same as not believing. In fact, what God asks us, what God calls us to, and what Abraham shows as an example to us is that it's not just okay. Sometimes it can be very, very good thing to question God, to ask God, as long as we are doing it in faith. In faith. That's the key, okay? So let me define, you're not going to find this definition in the Bible. This is my definition, okay? So do with it what you want. But let me define faith for you in this context. All right, you may have a different definition of faith. Hebrews chapter 11 gives us a definition of faith, which really works well here. But this is just in my words, okay? And that is, faith does not mean we don't ask questions. Faith doesn't mean we don't ask. Faith means we press on even when the answers don't seem complete. God gave Abraham some information, but it was not all the information. And when Abraham is going to push back in just a minute, we'll move into chapter 16, Abraham pushes back and God gives a little more information. Oh, well, if I would have known that, I might have chosen a little bit differently. That's okay. That's okay. You are acting for the glory of God. You are acting in faith. You are acting based on the information that you have because you asked. And so you act. Faith, don't get into a situation, or maybe this is challenging for you already. Like I said, maybe your background, whatever. It's okay to ask God questions. It's okay to talk to God in faith, like he's a close friend and you're trying to get more information. Because if we are trying to live for his glory, if we are trying to live out his design for us, his shape for us, doesn't it make sense that we would go back to him with questions? Right? And yet there are some traditions, there are some religions or whatever that seem to just completely block that off. Faith means no questions, just trust that it's all under control. I'm not seeing that in Scripture. And I certainly don't see that in Abraham's life. Okay, faith is not about a blind leap in the dark. Faith means that we ask questions and we move, we press on, we act on what we know, even if the answers don't seem complete. And as we move into chapter 16, that's exactly what we see Abraham doing. So, we scroll ahead, and we come to chapter 16. Now Sarai, before her name was changed to Sarah, Abram's wife had not given birth to any children, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. Okay, no problem. This is very common, not a big deal. So Sarai said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from having children, please sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have a family by her." So Abraham did what Sarai told him. Before we get to the next set of questions, let's think about living without complete answers. According to verse 3 there, after Abram had lived in Canaan for 10 years, Sarai, Abram's wife, gave Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to her husband to be his wife. This didn't happen tomorrow. This didn't happen next week or next month. This was 10 years after God said, "I'm going to make you into a great nation." This was almost 10 years, maybe most of 10 years, probably somewhere between 5 to 8 years after chapters 13 and 14. And we're at 15, and God says, "No, you're going to have a biological son." And so we're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing. This is not Abraham living impulsively. This is Abraham doing his best to trust, and there's nothing. And so he acted on the information he had. You will have a biological son. Notice God in chapter 15 did not say anything about Sarah. He said, "You will have a son from your own body." Okay? Within the cultural norms of his time. Sarah is now 75 years old. Okay? And even if Abraham can still bear children, there's a good chance that his 75-year-old wife cannot, right? So he worked within the system that he knew. He worked within the culture of his time, which included surrogate families. And this was very normal. And so he slept with Hagar. She got pregnant. And now Hagar had some problems, okay? She got an attitude with Sarah because Hagar got pregnant and Sarah didn't, and they turned into this big thing. And Sarah blamed Abraham, and we're not going to get into all that, okay? But the problem was not that Abraham had a child through Hagar. You'll notice, if you actually read all the way through here, not once did God condemn him for that. Not once. There's nothing in here that says, and God came to Abraham, how could you? You didn't trust me. And Abraham's like, but I waited for 10 years. None of that's in there. We sort of put that there with our brains. It's not in there. He worked with the information God had given him. He waited, he trusted, and when God did not seem to be doing what Abraham thought God was going to do, he acted within the cultural norms of his time, and God never condemned him. In fact, the son that came from Abraham and Hagar, named Ishmael, in chapter 17, Gary's going to spend more time on this next week. In chapter 17, God actually blessed Ishmael and his family. Okay? This wasn't a curse. It wasn't a whatever. In fact, as I thought about this whole, what I have up here, living without complete answers, it reminded me when we were in Ephesians just earlier this year. In chapter 5 of Ephesians, we find the principle of living in wisdom, right? And when the Bible does not give a clear-cut answer to our question, when God doesn't seem to be giving clear answers to our question, the principle of wisdom says that we search out as much information as we can, we gather all the data, we weigh all of the information, we weigh the facts, and then we prayerfully say, which is the one, which is the option, which is the action, what is the choice that will bring the most glory to God and growth for me. And we act on that, even when we don't have complete answers. I see Abraham practicing the principle of wisdom here. Okay, you may argue we don't like the culture of surrogate families. You may argue he shouldn't have had this other wife. You can argue all the things that you want to argue, but God never condemned him for this, ever. He lived out the principle of wisdom based on the information that he had prayerfully, and he acted. Now, in chapter 17, he's going to question God again, because God is still not giving everything that, he's not giving all the information. Okay? The question, and again, this is my paraphrase, you're not going to find this question in the text. The question number 3 is, can old people really have children? That is not the way it's phrased in your Bible. Don't look for it there, but that's what it is. Notice, push forward here, chapter 17, when Abraham was what? 99 years old. 99 years old. The Lord appeared to him and said, I am the sovereign God. Walk before me and be blameless. And I'll confirm my covenant between me and you, and I will give you a multitude of descendants. I'm 99, which means my wife is 89. If she was too old at 65, if she was too old at 75, I'm pretty sure 89 isn't making her more capable of having children. And so verses 3, really all the way down through 14, that's the word I'm looking for. Verse 3, all the way down through 14, is God giving Abraham the instructions of what to do to bring his whole family, and his family right now consists of Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, and the whole corporation. Okay, it's everybody who works for him as well. And it is at this point that God is going to give Abraham the sign of circumcision, physical circumcision that will apply to the nation of Israel moving forward. Physical circumcision, some of the Semitic people, some of the people in the land of Canaan and where Abraham was from, in that whole Middle Eastern area, some of them practiced circumcision, some of them did not. Okay, so this wasn't like a brand new thing that nobody had ever heard of before. But for an entire, he's got thousands of people. He's almost a nation here, but they're employees. For all these people to be circumcised and to make it a family and a corporate thing, that this is required, that was a little new. Okay? And God said, this is going to be the sign that you are living within the covenant that I gave you. In verses 3 through 14, God gives him the instructions. And in verse 15, God gives some new information. Then God said to Abraham, because he's changed his name now, as for your wife, you must no longer call her Sarai. Sarah will be her name. I will bless her, and I will give you a son through her. Now, it's not in here, but I'm guessing Abraham said, hold on, could you say that one more time? Could you clarify? This is what I thought I heard. Could you clarify? I will bless her, and she will become a mother of nations. Kings of countries will come from her. She's 89 years old. And so Abraham pushes back and says, can old people really have... Well, Abraham bowed down with his face to the ground and laughed. Okay, I didn't even put that on the slide. Abraham laughed at God. Okay, I'm not laughing at you, I'm laughing with you, is what we say in our house. He laughed at what God said, and he said to himself, can a son be born to a man who's 100 years old? And can Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Really? Come on, God. Come on. Like, I know you can do anything, but we're a little limited down here, right? And Abram, so that's the first question, can old people really have children? And then he pushed back a second time just immediately, verse 18. Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Listen, Ishmael is 13 years old at this point. Okay, we've fast forwarded, we've moved through some time if Abraham is 99. Ishmael's 13, and Abraham and Sarah have still been waiting, just assuming that Ishmael was going to be the heir, because God did not give them all the information. He did not give all the answers. And so Abraham and Sarah have just been doing life, living like this is what our new thing is. And God came back, verse 19, no. God likes to tell Abraham that. No, Sarah, your wife, is going to bear a son, and you will name him Yitzchak, Isaac, which means laughter. You may know that. Maybe you've never heard that before. Isaac means laughter. And in the next chapter, God will revisit this, and he will tell Sarah the same thing. You're going to name your kid Laughter because both of you laughed at me. Every time as little Isaac is running around and you call him Isaac, Isaac, you are going to be reminded for this kid's entire life, for the rest of your life, every time you call him, every time you take a family picture and write his name on the back, every time anything you do with this kid, when his name shows up, you're going to be reminded that you laughed at me. But I got the last laugh. I got the last laugh because you didn't think it was possible, and here he is. Here he is. Now, Ishmael and Isaac are both mentioned as part of these answers to these questions. As for Ishmael, verse 20, as for Ishmael, I've heard you. I've heard you. I've listened. and I will indeed bless him. I will make him fruitful. I'll give him a multitude of descendants. In fact, he'll become the father of 12 princes. And as we read through Genesis, when we get to the family of Ishmael, we find that 12 tribal nations came out of his descendants. And this is what has turned into the majority of the Arab people today. Can trace back, especially Muslims, but the Arab people in general love the fact that they can trace back to Abraham through Ishmael. It's not a question. They know it. They celebrate that. The Jewish people trace back to Abraham through Isaac. The Arab peoples trace back to Abraham through Ishmael. And God blessed Ishmael as a result of Abraham's question, why don't we just let Ishmael be my heir? I'll make him into a great nation, which of course goes back to Abraham as being a father of a great nation as well. But Ishmael is going to be a great nation. Ishmael is going to have a lot of descendants and all that. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac. That covenant back in chapter 12, that's through Isaac. That covenant back in chapter 15 where I walked through while you watched, that doesn't come through Ishmael. That doesn't go through any of Ishmael's descendants. The Arab peoples today have no claim on that covenant. Only the Jewish people, because as we move forward, it's even does not apply, does not get passed down even through all of Isaac's descendants, but just one of his sons, Jacob, who then is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. So if you're not a Jewish person, you don't get any claim on this Abrahamic covenant any more than the Arab peoples do who came through Ishmael. This is for Abraham's family, through Isaac, through Jacob, through those 12 sons of Jacob. But in case you missed it, I'm going to repeat myself. Verse 21, I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. At this set time next year. Now, we all know how this works, right? Abraham and Sarah had enough faith to keep trying. They've been trying for all this time to have children. Keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. And even though Abraham laughed and said it's completely impossible, they tried, right? And God finally allowed it to work. All right? Now, just real quick, just pay attention. And I've already said a couple of these things. It's a little bit. I said them a little bit earlier than I had planned to, but just 4 bullet points in my notes. I'm not putting it up on the slide. Okay, just timeline stuff. Abraham was 75 years old when God promised to make him into a great nation. Right, 75, chapter 12. He was 85 when he got Hagar pregnant, and 86 when Ishmael was born. So we've already waited 11 years until he finally had a biological son, like God promised. Oops, that wasn't the son that God promised. That was a different biological son, but God didn't tell him that. It was another 13 years before God promised him Isaac through Sarah, and then another year before he was born. It's been 25 years that Abraham has been waiting and believing. He's been trusting. He's been practicing the principle of wisdom. He's done everything right as far as he knew for 25 years before God finally got around to saying, oh yeah, that thing that I promised you 25 years ago, here, I'm finally fulfilling my part of that. 25 years. You think you've had to wait long? You've prayed for something for a long time? You've prayed and you've prayed and you've prayed, and it sounds like God is not answering, or it looks like God is answering in this way over here, and then it turns out, nope, that's not the way it was going to work anyway. Abraham waited for 25 years. 25 years. I'm not saying that you have to wait that long or I have to wait that long. It certainly seems that long sometimes, doesn't it? But here's what I know. Is that when God makes a promise, God keeps his promise. Every time. And it is okay for us to question him in faith as we're trying to do life between the promise and the answer. It's okay to ask questions. because we can trust him. I have one more set of questions that I want to do very quickly here and then get to a final thought. In chapter 18, Abraham questioned God, and you may know the narrative here, the setup. God and two angels come to have lunch with Abraham. I mean, just that concept right there. How cool is that? God and two angels show up on Abraham's door and says, hey, let's have lunch. Okay. So Abraham sat down and had lunch with God and two angels. I mean, that's just, that is just very cool right there, right? And so halfway through chapter 18, God looks at the two angels, and I think this is a pre-incarnate Christ, Jesus before he was born as Jesus, the eternal Son. He looks at the two angels and he says, hey, should I let Abraham know what I'm about to do? In front of Abraham. Now Abraham is like, well, yeah, I mean, now you have to tell me, right? You know, you can't just leave me hanging. And God and the angels apparently just said, yeah, sure, why not? And so God said, listen, there are some cities down, and there's 5 cities down at the tip of the Dead Sea. Now it's called the Valley of Salt. If you remember what happens in chapter 19, where God sent sulfur and salt and to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and these other cities, he destroyed 4 of them, kept 1. He said, I'm going to do, these people are wicked. The cry from the few righteous people, the cry from creation, the cry from everywhere around here has come up to me, and it is so great, I'm just going to wipe them out. And Abraham knows, I have family down there. My nephew, Lot, went to live down there. I have great nieces and nephews or whatever. I have family down there. And so he negotiates with God. And if you haven't read this in a while, or if you don't know this story, you've got to read chapter 18, because if you thought these first couple of questions sounded a little sassy, wait until you get to chapter 18, right? And the first question was, will you destroy the righteous along with the wicked? And God said, no, I will not destroy the righteous along with the wicked. In fact, I'll tell you what I'll do. If I find righteous people down there, I'll spare the whole thing. I'll even spare the wicked people for the sake of the righteous people. And that got Abraham thinking and said, great, well, what if there are 50? Will that work? God says, I'll spare the whole region if I can find 50 people that are righteous. And Abraham thought that might be a little high. Knowing the region, he says, what about 45? 45 work? And Abraham, I love this. God allowed Abraham to negotiate with him. Remember, he's a CEO. I'm sure he's done some negotiations before. So all of a sudden, Abraham goes into business mode. Sitting across the table there, he's like, what about 45? Yeah, okay, 45 is good. All right, what about 40? Just working his way down. He got it all the way down to 10. God, what if you find only 10 righteous people in this entire region? Would you spare them? God says, sure. That should have been a red flag to Abraham, just saying. Okay? Abraham was sure that his nephew Lot had some kind of influence in the area. God found 3.5 righteous people. Actually, God found 1 righteous person, Lot. 2 Peter tells us that Lot was righteous. God found 1 righteous person and his immediate family, and the angels went down there. You can read in chapter 19, and literally the 2 angels grabbed the 4 of them, Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters by the hands, and had to drag them out of the city before the entire region was flattened. Even the righteous person they had to drag out. But God honored Abraham's request to not destroy the righteous along with the wicked. Isn't that awesome? Because Abraham pushed back, because Abraham asked questions in faith, he honored Abraham's request and rescued him. The next question that was part of this is a question that I have memorized. This is chapter 18, verse 25. I want to show you this, 18:25. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the godly with the wicked, treating the godly and the wicked alike. This is part of that same thing. But here's the question. I want you to put this in your mind. I want you to memorize this question. I want you to think of this question. It has so many ramifications in our lives. It has so many ramifications everywhere else, in specific situations. Will not the judge of the whole earth do what is right? I don't have to know every detail. I don't have to know every answer. I don't have to know everything. But here's my question. God, isn't it true, won't you do what's right? And of course, the answer is yes. God never actually answers this rhetorical question in the text. He never says, of course I will. He says no a lot, but he doesn't say yes to this question. Because it's an assumed thing. I will prove, I have proven, and as we read through the scriptures, God has proven his righteous character time and time and time again. Will God do what is right? He will always do what is right. Because, and this gets really philosophical, but whatever God does is right. That's why trust is so important. It's not that God can't mess up and do something wrong. It's that because of who God is, whatever God does is right every time. And if we are bumping up against that, we're the ones who are wrong, not him. And yet he calls us to ask him questions. He calls us to push back, even maybe to negotiate a little bit in faith, because faith is not about not having questions. Faith is about pressing on, even when the answers don't seem complete. Let's wrap it up. I pointed to this, but I want to show it to you. In the book of Romans. Romans chapter 4. Paul quotes a couple of different times from Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. Questioning God in faith applies to salvation as well as Christian living. Look at Romans chapter 4, starting in verse, I said 21. Let's go back to 19. Without being weak in faith, he considered his own body as dead because he was 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. But he did not waver in unbelief about the promise of God. He may have wavered in unbelief. He may not have understood the details of how it could happen, but he did not waver in the promise of God, and that's the key. But was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God. He was fully convinced, this is the key verse right here. He was fully convinced that what God promised, he was also able to do. And so it was credited to him as righteousness. It wasn't just that he believed the promise. It wasn't that he believed that he would have a son. It was that he believed in the character of the one who made the promise. Our faith is not in what God promised, but who God is when he makes the promise. Our faith is in God. And so the statement, it was credited to him, was not written just for his sake, but also for our sake, to whom it will be credited. Those who believe in the one who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. Salvation is not just believing that Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus died for our sins. That's the detail, that's the what. But salvation comes when we place our faith in the one who actually did it, knowing that he will fulfill the rest of it. That because of what Jesus did 2,000 years ago, God promised he will fulfill and give us life now and in the future. That's where salvation comes from. And if all you believe is just the facts, well, yeah, Jesus died for my sins, but you're not believing in the source of the promise, God himself, you're still missing part of the gospel. You've got to believe in the God behind the promise, not just the promise. He was given over because of our transgressions. He was raised for the sake of our justification. So questioning God in faith applies to salvation as well. Is this true? Can I trust you? And faith for salvation says, yes, I believe that what you said from 2,000 years ago, you will actually do. You are doing today, and you will do it in the future. And finally, here's our question. Call it your big application, call it whatever. Here's your question. Am I doing my best for God's glory with the information that I have now? Am I living out the principle of wisdom? Or am I sitting here making God give me all the answers before I will even take a step? Am I requiring God to give me all the stuff? I've got to have all the stuff. Listen, I'm a guy who likes to have all the answers. God doesn't work that way. He didn't work that way for Abraham. He doesn't work that way throughout history, throughout the scriptures. He gives us what we need to know at that time, and he says, you got to trust me, and you need to act on what I've given you. And even if that seems to be bad in hindsight, notice that God did not condemn because we acted in faith. That's my challenge today. As we look at the life of Abraham, it's okay to question God in faith, but press on even if the answers don't seem complete. Live out the principle of wisdom for God's glory, for your growth. And I think that's what he expects from us.